Want to get ahead in life, but how do you do it? Our next guest may be able to offer you some insight. He's come through a lot, including addiction and post-traumatic stress, and he's written a book about it, about accepting fear and how to use it as a springboard to accomplishment. Akshay Nanavati is the author of Fearvana and joins us now to talk some more about that. Thanks for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We all have fears. We all have doubt. What made you realize or put it together that you could use fear to propel yourself forward?
You know, when I got out of drug addiction in high school, that's when I joined the Marines. And through that experience, I started to realize the value in pushing our limitations and engaging fear. So from there, I went mountain climbing in the Himalayas. I went skydiving, cave diving, rock climbing, skiing across polar ice caps. And of course, spending 7 months in Iraq with the U.S. Marines was a fairly terrifying experience. I mean, my job out there was to walk in front of our vehicle convoys and search for improvised explosive devices before they could be used to blow up our vehicles. So fairly dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And some might say, look, because you're training, you're a person who has no problem taking on that kind of risk or dealing with your fears. But the average or ordinary person might find it more difficult. What do you say to them?
I had to work my way up. I mean, when I was a child, I was terrified of Ferris wheels. So I was by no means born with this innate desire to embrace and engage my fears. It really resulted in a step-by-step process. And as I did it more, I realized the value, and not just in terms of the personal and spiritual growth, but also leading to happiness as well. It was just a beautiful thing when you get to engage your fears and find the courage within.
Now, at one point in your book, you talk about the inner voice and how really negative it can be, how much it can hold you back. Why do you think our inner voices are so negative?
There's a psychological condition called the negativity bias, where we actually lean more towards the negative, and we use pain as a greater motivator than pleasure. So it's something we all have to just deal with. But when we channel it, when we step above that voice and learn to channel into something meaningful, in time, through purposeful action, we can actually change what even first shows up in the brain. And it can become more positive just through practice, like anything, really. It's just a matter of creating that space between that instinctive voice, what we do with it, and as we continue to change our actions consciously, we change what shows up subconsciously as well.
Give me an example, because I know in your book you use a lot of research and studies to illustrate what you're talking about. Give me an example of something you saw or read about that shows how you can move past fear, even if it's in smaller steps.
Sure. So neuroscience has shown we don't control what first shows up in our brain. So I'll give you an example of how I turned an emotion that I couldn't necessarily control into something useful for me. So when I came back from the war, I had lost friends out there. And I struggled with survivor's guilt for a long time. I mean, it drove me to alcoholism and to the brink of suicide. And until I started to become more conscious of it, I got more present to my guilt. When I hit that low moment, I started researching this neuroscience, psychology, spirituality, and I became more aware of these emotions. And ultimately, I learned to channel that emotion into something meaningful. So now, for example, I have a poster up on my wall with my friend and a picture of him and me, and it says, "This should have been you. Earn this life." So this emotion that once drove me to alcoholism and suicide is now the same emotion that drives me to staying sober, to doing something meaningful, to finishing this book, and to making a greater impact in the world. And it's the same with any emotion. Any emotion can be translated to something meaningful as well. Even with fear, I mean, everything I do, I'm terrified. But that's why I do it, because when you step into that fear, it's the most beautiful thing you'll ever experience.
Let's talk about the Dalai Lama, because he wrote the foreword to your book, which is quite incredible. How did you manage that?
It was a huge blessing, of course, as you can imagine. I actually just reached out to the office over there. I found one point of contact there just through a lot of research, and I shot a personal video for His Holiness, sharing my story, sharing the struggles I've been through, sharing the impact we're trying to make with Fearvana in the world to create a sort of happier and more meaningful life for everybody in the world, and that we're giving away all the proceeds to charity. So just after sort of 4 months of this communication with the particular monk in the office there, I finally got the forward, and it was really just a beautiful thing to have that in my house and have that in my in the book as well, because we have a frame of his forward up on my wall.
So actually, if you wanted to leave people with one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think the single most important thing, the key takeaway from my book, is to develop a positive relationship to suffering. If you learn how to struggle well, if you learn to embrace challenges, not only will you be able to handle when life hits you in the face, but you'll be able to handle the challenges that stand between where you are now and where you want to be. And my favorite way to do that is exercise. Exercise has been my salvation.
Akshay Nanavati, author of Fearvana, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.